Next key process we have under the monitoring and controlling phase is monitor the risks. So as we already have explained and we have dived through the controlling the quality, we looked onto the audits, to the cost of quality, we looked onto these inspections, the benefits, best practices, how to apply it in, let's say, real world examples. Now it's the time to move not to control the resources, which we're going to cover next sessions, but since the monitoring the risks are very important concepts, I decided to cover monitoring the risks as this session starts. So risk monitoring is an ongoing process through the all of the project lifecycle, and it involves tracking the known risks, identifying new risks, and assessing the effectiveness of these response plans or mitigation strategies. And without continuous monitoring, risks can escalate, leading to a major project delays or failures. So again, risk monitoring ensures that the identified risks are tracked and new risks are identified. And it aligns with the PMI monitor risks process under the risk management, where it focuses on the continuous risk assessment to help preventing negative impact on the project objectives. The key ITTOs involved at this process when monitoring the risks. PMI monitoring risk relies on key inputs such as the risk management plan and the work performance data, and some of these, let's say, issue logs, and some of these tools. Um, um, Common tools here uses trend analysis and risk audits. Some of them use the reserve analysis to help you evaluating the ongoing risks. And the outputs here include the to update the project management documentation and some of the work performance information. It can be produced and change request if needed. Also updating the risk register, which is a very important artifact of the project, which is the risk register, where you track all of these risks with its impact, with its qualitative, quantitative analysis results, with its updates. So updating the risk register here is very important thing to do as well. Let's now understand identifying or the emerging risks. So emerging risks are those that were not initially identified. So if you recall when we were planning the project and we have set our risk register, we identified our risks, we have done our qualitative, quantitative analysis, we set all of these mitigation plans. So these emerging risks are were not part of the initial list. So again, emerging risks here are those who were not initially identified but arise as the project progresses. So effective monitoring to these risks include identifying the risk triggers and using scenario analysis to predict and mitigate these risks before they impact the project. And the key concepts here we are gonna cover is the emerging risk, as we say, that is unforeseen risks that could arise during the project execution and were not identified earlier. Also, the risk triggers. Risk trigger means the early indicators that the risk event may occur. It says that in case of that indicator happen or in case of that event happen, so this could be called as the risk trigger. Scenario analysis, as the third concept here we have, is where you predict the potential project risks before they escalate. Risk audits and monitoring the risk. So risk audits also is part of, think of also the quality audits where we were covering what are the inspection, the audits that we were conducting to uncover all of these quality issues, defects, and rework to reduce the rework opportunities um, or risks. So now in this time we are gonna talk about risk audits, which is a structured reviews of the risk management activities. And these audits ensures that the risk response strategies are working effectively and highlight the areas that requires an adjustment. The key concept here we have when doing risk audits and monitoring the risks is the purpose of risk audit. The purpose of risk audit, it should evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management process. So here the purpose of conducting the risk audit is to evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management processes and, for example, the mitigation strategies that you have set as part of the risk register. Also, the frequency of audits. Frequency of audits, it should be conducted at regular intervals or during the major milestones. The audit outcomes here as a key concept where it identifies the gaps in risk responses and should suggest as improvements. So, if you recall when we talked about quality audits, we said that we have identified the issue, we understood the root causes. Now it's the time to implement, let's say, the actions to avoid, let's say, falling into such quality issues. Talked about the preventive and the corrective actions. The same thing here goes with audit outcomes. So the audit outcomes, it needs to identify the gaps or the risks and in terms of risk responses and mitigation strategies, and it needs to suggest an improvement in order to improve the risk response outcome. When talking about reviewing the effectiveness of the risk responses, which is our main goal here of conducting, let's say, risk audits, assessing the risk responses effectiveness is made, to ensure that the mitigation strategies are working. Key metrics help here to measure the success of the risk responses, while also the lessons learned provide an insight to refine the future risk management strategies. So we're gonna talk about two key metrics here is the risk response effectiveness. You can think of it's a percentage of the mitigated risks. Okay. Also have the other key metric here can be used, which is response implementation speed, which means the time we are taken to respond to a risk or to implement its mitigation strategy or to implement its risk response. So we have two key metrics here. You can, let's say, review the effectiveness of your risk responses by understanding the risk response effectiveness, also the response implementation speed. And the key, let's say, the other tool here we have said that it's the lessons learned. And lessons learned, it's used to evaluate the past risks to improve the future responses. Let's take an example here where is an IT project that used the performance metric to assess the risk response effectiveness by analyzing the past incidents and, let's say, looking at the previous lessons learned from the other projects. And by doing that, they improved the system redundancy and reducing the downtime by the percent. Risk trend analysis for continuous monitoring. So trend analysis, as one of these tools, it helps the project teams to track how the risks evolve over the time. By identifying the patterns, the teams can anticipate the potential issues, take preventive actions before the risks escalate. Trend analysis here, it helps you by identifying the patterns and the risk occurrences. Also, you have this risk heat map or the risk heat map. It's a visual representation of the risk level in case that you have a risk that it was identified as high, let's say, severity or high impact or high, let's say, probability. If you recall, when we done the qualitative risk analysis, where we have assigned values to each of these risks, where we say that this risk might happen, might not. We assign values like from 1 to 5 on the occurrence, whether it's going to happen or not. So by the probability and the impact, you create this risk heat map, visualize the representation of the risk levels, and it shows their let's say they're changing over time. So this is all about the risk heat map. Okay, when it comes to early warning system, an early warning system is like alerts the project teams to potential risk escalation before they happen, and that you could set a trigger. So in case of that trigger happens, that has to create an alert that it needs to your attention as a project and project managers teams to do, let's say, evaluation to that risk and monitor it closely. when it comes to communicating the risks status to the stakeholders. So this is one of the project manager responsibility. Keep all of these stakeholders informed about and communicated about these risks, with their mitigation strategies, with their, let's say, their status and their updates. So effective risk monitoring requires a clear communication with the stakeholders. Regular risk reports and update ensures that the decision makers have the necessary information to take the corrective actions when needed. As part of your communication to the stakeholders on the risk status, think of sharing the risk reports where you summarize all of the current risks and their status. Also, the stakeholder updates ensures the transparency in risk handling. And as I mentioned, it make it easy to for the decision makers to have all of the necessary real-time information, take and immediate corrective actions once needed. Also helps and supports the decision support by helping the leadership to take informed actions immediately. So this is the importance of communicating the risk status to the stakeholder and keep them informed about whatever updates on these risks. The next concept here we have is proactive risk control strategies. So proactive risk control ensures that the team can quickly adjust the responses as a new risk emerges. With having a contingency plans and escalation procedures in place, it reduces the likelihood of the project disruptions. And some of these response or let's say to risk strategies is by risk response adjustment. And the first strategy here by start by modifying the risk strategies based on the new insights or new data that has came in. So based on that, you say um, you adjust the risk response, even though that it was identified and agreed. But maybe some of these risks might have new evolving data and new risks also that could impact, let's say, the mitigation plans. It make it more, let's say, ineffective. So you need to keep having these in mind to adjust your risk responses when needed. Also, the one of these risk control strategies and escalation procedures. So if you recall that one of these risk responses were uh, said to one of these risks where we have to escalate. So escalating is like taking it to the next level where you have no control of. By the escalation procedures or following the escalation procedures, like involving the Syrian management when these risks exceed the control limits. Also, one of these important strategies we already have talked about when we were doing the qualitative or the quantitative risk analysis, where we have identified the risk impact in terms of cost. So you need to set these contingency reserves in terms of cost and time by allocating an additional time or budget for the high risk activities. So these are the key proactive risk control strategies that you need to keep monitoring closely to ensure that all of these risks are, let's say, efficiently tracked and monitored to reduce the impact on the project, let's say, disruptions. Here are some of these common challenges that you might face when monitoring these risks. So common challenges in risk monitoring include the incomplete documentation, where you have no complete information about each of these risks, or you don't have data to analyze and to evaluate these risks. Also, the lack of real-time data. So, implementing or having, let's say, lack or having a lack of information or lack of real-time data about these risks that were, say, missed during the planning phases. If you recall, when we have identified these risks, can cause, let's say, and issues when you are dealing with these risks. Also, the lack of data when there's insufficient information to predict the risk impact. So, if you don't have, let's say, um, enough experienced team who can, say, analyze the impact in terms of time and budget, and maybe you have, let's say, not set contingency reserve in terms of the budget and time. If you didn't, and if you weren't able to assess the situation itself by predicting the right impact of that risk, means that you don't have lack of data, or you don't have or let's say you have no professionals that can help you in supporting and predicting the risk impact. And lastly, here we have is the resistant to risk reporting. Resistant is to risk reporting is like the teams that hesitate to escalate the risks for not having an accountability or not doing their work. That will really impact the project outcomes, because when not escalating things, it becomes more escalated within the team itself. Then they might, face a bottleneck that it has impacted the project outcomes um, heavily. So you need, as a project manager, to keep, enhancing the decision making within your team, making them not having a fear or resistance to report any new risks, to not have the fear of reporting and identifying these new risks, because the more risks have control over, and the more or less impact they will impact the project outcomes. So these common challenges we talked in risk monitoring, the patient, lack of real-time data, and also the resistance to report these risks. And overcoming these barriers ensures that a more resilient project environment and project team. To summarize our first session on talking about risk monitoring here, we talked about effective risk monitoring is not one-time activity, but a continuous effort throughout the project lifecycle. And by leveraging the data-driven insights and engaging the stakeholders, teams can proactively manage risks and enhance the project success.